think everybody's just come on in with a drink, so we may as well get started. So my name's Matthew Taylor, and I'm the chair of Folio. So on behalf of Folio and also the Disruptive Business Network, which Rahul Soanes runs, I'd just like to thank you for joining us all this evening for a pretty unique in-person event post-COVID, and it's called The Pilgrim's Guide to the Workplace. We'll no doubt talk tonight about working remotely and also working in the office, but for us it's actually a really special pleasure to be back in person, running these kind of conversation events, to come together, meeting new people, discovering new ideas and insights, and also collectively exploring the many issues that are impacting our communities, just like the future of work, which appears to be evolving far sooner, I think, than expected, and right here in the present moment at this event. I'll begin by just acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're gathered, all in one place this time, which is lovely. And that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And they've lived here and cared for the Birrarung, or the Yarra River, in and around present-day Melbourne for countless generations before British colonisation. And I'd like to just acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people who may be joining us this evening. So, if you haven't been to a Folio event before, Folio is a contemporary forum that brings together diverse people to have really meaningful conversations about the issues that matter. So we gather every month for what we call our Folio conversations, and really we explore the big issues of our times, which is, you know, the challenges and opportunities we're all facing. And we do that in conversation setting, a trusted and intimate setting really, and they're led by really amazing thinkers and doers from Australia and also internationally, just like Agustin here. And these forums are unique from a few different perspectives. We curate the conversations for diversity. So we try and bring people together from across different sectors, disciplines, occupations and backgrounds, and we bring them together with more than one, usually two international or Australian leaders on a particular topic, and those leaders bring different perspectives on the topic so that we can, you know, explore things more deeply and more broadly. So tonight we're actually doing something a little bit different. So normally our Folio conversations have two distinct halves of the conversation, and tonight we're sticking to that format, but we're actually mixing up the format a little to offer a unique experience. So we've joined forces with Rahul, who's the founder of the Disruptive Business Network, which is an event series and a consultative service that looks at how new ideas and technology are changing business, which is highly relevant to today's topic. And together, we're hosting Dr. Agustin Chevez, an architect and academic who has dedicated his career and more recently his body on his pilgrimage between Melbourne and Sydney on foot to understanding the notion of work and uncovering environments that best support our working lives. I'll let Rahul introduce Agustin as we're kicking off proceedings tonight with a behind-the-scenes live recording of the Disruptive Business Network's podcast, which is called On Meaningful Work. So I highly recommend not only to check out this, I guess you're seeing it firsthand, but there are some amazing episodes from a range of different people talking about meaningful work. And at around 7:15, maybe 7:30, we'll take a short 10-minute intermission just to stretch our legs, top up our drinks, go to the bathroom, and then, you know, with that fuel in our bodies, we'll continue on with our conversation. So when we're back in our seats, we'll turn off the cameras and we'll turn off the microphones and we'll have an off-the-record Folio conversation with Agustin and all of our other special guests, which is all of you. And I'll facilitate the conversation on behalf of Folio, and where the conversation goes from there is up to all of you, and also to you, Agustin, because you get to directly engage too. I'll explain a little bit more about how that off-the-record conversation is going to work after the podcast. But in the meantime, please take care to minimise noise and movement while we're recording the podcast. And lastly, before I hand over to you, Rahul, we'll all have the best part of the next hour to, I guess, go on a second-hand journey of your pilgrimage, Agustin, and hear your story, and also all the lessons that you learned along the way and that are now documented in Agustin's new book, which is called, no surprises, The Pilgrim's Guide to the Workplace. I actually had the privilege before this event to read a confidential reviewer's draft of Agustin's book, And I just must say, to begin, I really admire the intellectual humility and dedication to thinking deeply on any topic, but also a topic that's so important, not only in the current moment in terms of what's happening in our society, but also just an important facet of all of our lives. Because if we're privileged enough to find and maintain work over an entire career, our work lives and the workplaces we operate in, wherever that may be now, is expected to take on average about 80,000 hours of our life. So it's no insignificant part of our life. So figuring out how to do that better and how to design better workplaces for our working lives is something that is extremely important to all of us. But also in terms of the book, despite drawing on several disciplines and also very disparate sources from philosophy, sociology, psychology, it was all over the place in some ways, but in an amazing way, Agustin managed to keep it accessible and entertaining. And dare I say, it was much more like reading pracademic work than an academic work, which I swear is a compliment. But also had the rigour that you'd expect from someone who's done their PhD in the evolution of workplace architecture as a consequence of technology development. So if we think about what's happened in our working lives recently, that PhD is highly, highly relevant. His book actually forces us to grapple with the complexity but also the uncertainty of the future of work, and it serves as a guidebook to help us all navigate our own pathways to meaningful work and workplaces that better support our working lives. And to get the most from tonight's event, I wanted to start with a quote, which actually is toward the end of the book, about the nature of a pilgrimage. And Reverend Robin Willis observed that you could journey all around the world on foot and not be a pilgrim, because your heart and mind are not open to the insights, and maybe you haven't had the conversations which will shock you from the most strange people. On the other hand, you could be at home and be a pilgrim in heart and mind. So a pilgrimage is not about physical movement. So while we sit on our bums tonight, and our physical movement's restricted to this room, I encourage us all to open our hearts and minds as a fellow pilgrim. And as we're listening to Agustin's story while we're recording the podcast, I just invite all of us to reflect on our own experiences of work and the different workplaces we've all occupied, and think of some exciting questions for the folio conversation afterwards. But I'll hand over to you, Rahul. Thanks, Agustin.
Thank you for that, Matt. Welcome to a live recording of the On Meaningful Works podcast. And before I start, I just want to say how weird and wonderful it is to say that in front of a group of people. Usually when I do these introductions, I'm alone at home staring at a blank wall. So this is really a treat. But before we dive in, the On Meaningful Work podcast, usually it is about tracing the journeys of people that I think have found true purpose and meaning in the work that they do. But in this case, it's a little bit different in that we are tracing a literal journey with Agustin. And before we bring him on, let me read out a brief bio. So, as an architect and academic, Dr. Agustin Chevez has dedicated his career to understanding the notion of work and uncovering environments that best support our working lives. Agustin's interest in the relationship between people, space, and technology saw him pursue a PhD on the evolution of workplace architecture as a consequence of technology development. His work has been presented at various international forums and publications. He is a workplace consultant and Adjunct Research Fellow at the Center of Design and Innovation at Swinburne University, and an Honorary Fellow at the School of Management and Marketing at the University of Melbourne. I'm going to call you Gus, if that's all right.
Please.
Gus, welcome to the On Meaningful Work podcast.
Thank you, Rahul, and thanks everyone for being here.
So, before we get into the book, and your book traces your journey, this crazy journey that you went on, and there are a number of signposts. But if I could kind of ask you a personal question, like as you were, maybe as an adolescent or a young person, what were the signposts in your life that led you to being an architect?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to contextualize the idea of a signpost. So I came up with lessons in the book that, to continue with the analogy of walking and pilgrimage, I call them signposts. We'll discuss why in a minute. But so these signposts are like lessons that point to something. And when I was writing the book, I was a bit hesitant of using signposts because they give us the belief that as we go through life, we see signposts that tell us where to go, and that's not the case. We'll discuss a bit later, but the signposts, the lessons, took me years. The walk from Melbourne to Sydney took 42 days. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But to digest what came out of it literally took years. So the idea that we have these signs as we go through life that tell us where to go can be a bit misleading. Signposts, in my opinion, seem to happen always retrospectively. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have any signposts that led me to go do architecture. I just had a pleasure talking to an architecture student, just graduated recently. And in my case, I must admit, I have not an inner passion to become an architect. Mm-hmm. It was something that interests me, but I grew to love it with a passion that now led me to do this crazy thing, with a very interesting story around X-ray machines. Mm-hmm. So I was already here. I'm studying architecture in Mexico. Again, a little bit by inertia. I have a gap year in Paris, where I had the opportunity to be engaged with architecture, with our desire of making life beautiful, ourselves through fashion, cuisine, architecture. So perhaps that influenced me to go to the mainstream type of architecture to beautify the world. Mm. Then came here, long story, but I needed to do my registration as an architect. So I worked for a project in a health project. Halfway through the process, the client changed an X-ray machine from analog, the old school ones that you have the X-ray, and to digital. Mm-hmm. And that created so many changes in the building. We needed to get rid of so many viewing boxes, and we were behind the 8 ball trying to, follow that change. We were so busy working on the delivery of the hospital and making those changes that we didn't have time to think about how that changed the interaction of people with their environment, mm-hmm. and with each other. So I was more worried about that than responding an RFI to the builder or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I realized that to think about architecture, you cannot work in architecture, mm-hmm. and vice versa. So that's when I wanted to take some time for doing architecture, to think about architecture. So my passion really about architecture, mm-hmm. started with an X-ray machine and how, mm-hmm. we interact with space and with each other.
So then, just following up on that, this is perhaps a basic question, but then what is architecture? Is it just about making buildings beautiful, or is it?
Well, no, and that's something I talk about the book, perhaps, and this is from the CEO of IDEO, that says that design in general has come to become a downstream discipline in which the role is to beautify an idea that someone else had. Mm-hmm. How I see the biggest opportunity for designers is that they conceive themselves, or they're part of designing that idea. So one of the signposts that I talk about in the book is design work first, mm-hmm. then the workplace. Mm-hmm. If we do that, we have the potential to unleash new value about workplace environments. Mm-hmm. Because by the time the idea of work reaches us as designers, mm-hmm. is riddled with shortcomings. So we have an opportunity to design the notion of work first, and then its container, mm-hmm. will be in a better place. So to answer, for me, now I see the world in a very narrow, singular lens, but very wide, I must say. There's the notion of work. Mm-hmm. So for me, architecture, I see it and interpret through work environments. Mm-hmm. But through that, we can understand what makes us human. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But for me, is how to use the space, the physical environment, which change space into place, mm-hmm. with everything that goes into it, to host the nature of work.
Sure. There's a lot to get into there, but let's kind of dial it back and talk about, I think firstly talk about the book and how the idea for the book came about.
So the book came about to record this pilgrimage to Sydney, which I always...
So the question should be, what spawned the idea to do this pilgrimage to Sydney?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I try to clarify always the difference between a walk and a pilgrimage. And what I did, I want to frame it as a pilgrimage, because a walk is what connects you between 2 points, and the pilgrimage is the insights that you get out of that experience. So this book and the conversations that we're going to have today are about what I learned, not the distance that I covered.
Can I just ask, though, like usually when you think of the word pilgrimage, it has a strong spiritual or religious connotation to it. Did that come into your frame of thinking? Or?
No, mine was a secular one. There's many attributes to a pilgrimage. One is having rules. Some of them are to increase the discomfort of the pilgrim itself, never to enhance the well-being. We're going to talk about the type of rules. So I attach it through some of the rules and what makes a pilgrimage other than the spiritual aspect. But the reason I did it was not for fundraising. Some people ask me, why do you do it? You know, and a lot of them think it was...
Which charity are you supporting?
Which charity are you? And I talk about that in the book. If you say I did it for this and that charity, people will immediately understand and give, here's $5 and good on you and keep going. But I did it for something very weird. I mean, I still sometimes find it interesting that I'm actually here saying why I did it in front of people. I was traveling a lot between Melbourne and Sydney, and we were presenting the research about workplace design. And we were presenting about how to design environments that bring people together to increase collaboration and interaction to each other, right? And on the flight back from that night, late at night, you know, the typical night commute flight, you're all tired, a packed airplane. Anyway, took out my iPad and start reading. I was reading a book called The Magic of Reality from Richard Dawkins. And in that, there's a chapter that is about why there's so many animals in the planet. So Dawkins was explaining Darwin's proposition about why is it that there's so many different animals in the planet. And he gives the example of the islands in the Galapagos Islands, which some of you might know. And the argument is that the islands, through isolation, the physical barriers that the islands presented, allow iguanas to evolve completely different through millions of years. So the only sea iguana in the world lives there because it evolved very, very differently from the other ones. And then as I was reading, I read one paragraph that I have to put the book down and really change my take on, just like the X-ray machine, my take on workplace design. That it says that it was isolation that gave us all the diversity of species that we have come to see. And at that moment, put the book down and I started reflecting, well, I just had clients meeting with clients talking about how to give those little iguanas boats to interact with each other, to increase innovation. And now I'm hearing that it's actually the opposite. So I thought, what if Melbourne and Sydney were in two different islands of the Galapagos, and instead of being populated by iguanas, they were populated by ideas. And I thought that the ease of travel, what is creating is a very prolific colony of ideas. We have a lot of them, all multiplying, but all from the same strand. There's no diversity. So I thought, well, what will happen if I incubate an idea for the time that it takes me to walk from Melbourne to Sydney? In complete isolation, with no email or SMSing or what do you think about this?
But also no music or
no
podcasts.
So that's when the rules come. So I structured the pilgrimage around having two rules. And the two rules, one of them was by myself. So my backpack, well, I have two backpacks, one in the back here on the front, and was self-sufficient. And I will just send an SMS at night saying, I arrived here, so if something happened, you know around where to look. And the other one is no music, no podcast, no nothing. so that I could actually incubate the idea with my thoughts, which at the time sounds great, but from the two rules, the second one, without any music or anything, was much more difficult because you're left with your own thoughts. And
Now, I was just going to jump in and say, like, I think what's amazing about that is, like, I've had plenty of crazy ideas and crazy things I want to do, but, like, the gap between having the idea and taking action is most of the time infinite. So how did you go about putting this plan into action?
again, so the scale of a pilgrimage is in years.
Yeah.
It's in years for you to realize what you learn, but also I think it's years in the making. So for the moment I came across the iguanas in the Galapagos in that fateful flight back from Sydney, and the moment I put my backpack and started walking were 2 years. In those 2 years, I actually needed to convince myself that it was worth doing because who does that? I mean, who actually walks from Melbourne to Sydney because they read a book about iguanas in the Galapagos Islands and they want to incubate a unique idea about how to design better workplaces. And I needed to, it was very important for me to stick to that narrative for myself and others, if they ask me, to be able to justify it like that. And the problem was, or the good thing was, that at the time, every other conference that you went to was about activity-based working and open plan office. And I said, I cannot retire. I cannot write my last paper or workplace strategy around open plan and activity-based working. So I wanted to incubate a unique idea, and that's what triggered me. But I was in conflict because it stands in opposition of what we think is rational.
Yeah, and so going back to your point earlier, just on, you walking in isolation without any books or audiobooks or podcasts or any of that. And the thing you mentioned in the book is how boredom really affected you. And in reading that, I had this realization that I can't remember the last time I was properly bored, because I'm constantly listening to something, or I'm constantly with people, or even if I'm alone, I'm usually watching something or reading something. It's like boredom seems to be like this scarce resource almost. But one of the signposts was that how we need to cultivate boredom.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So I started my walk for the pilgrimage. And, the first day, selfies, and this is great, and wow. Second day, yeah, it's good. By third, they started to get old. By the fourth, I was bored beyond belief. Like day in, day out, just looking. I mean, I have some amazing pictures and this and that, but most of my walks were just looking at pavement and listening to traffic and no stimulus at all. No stimulus, other than just not getting run over by a coming traffic. There was nothing. So I really, really struggled with boredom to the point that it was distracting. And at what point I thought, you know what, this is ridiculous because I cannot think of how bored I am.
In what way was it distracting? Was it just
that I cannot literally think. I'm so bored. I started, another thing that came out of it is garbage. I learned a lot about garbage because as I was coming into towns, it was almost clean, but I could tell by the time I was approaching a town, by the time of amount of rubbish I'll see. Funny enough, I mean, you can make assumptions about how many energy drinks you see and the smoking. Pregnancy tests. I mean, who goes? I saw so many pregnancy tests, and I could even forecast the demographic growth
the population
of
the town. Yeah.
And if gender parties would have been a thing back then, I couldn't even tell gender. But
so a lot of them are positive.
No, negative, which should be a concern. But the thing is, I started looking at. One thing that clicked is glass, broken glass. And this sounds weird. Be with me, because some of these insights, you need to be bored for at least 30 days to get into the zone. Imagine being in this state and not seeing anything. So I saw broken glass. And my mind immediately, without me trying to do anything, tried to bring meaning out of it, tried to construct and say it's a broken bottle. And that gave me lead to think how we're meaning, we crave on meaning. We crave on meaning even if we don't, if we avoid it. We are hardwired to find patterns, create meaning. There was another...
I have a great podcast recommendation. Anyway, sorry.
So that was a thing, trying to find meaning even in discarded things, and I talk about learning from that. So going back...
So just with the broken bottle, like, what is the meaning that you that you were able to capture from that?
Our craving, and my brain was satisfied with that. Another one, when I crossed, funny enough, I noticed so many differences between Victoria and New South Wales. In Victoria, there were more broken bottles. In New South Wales, I found more fishing nets, strings. And again, I will find patterns in discarded. And the one that fascinated me was how long I could walk in a string that was completely untangled, and things like that. But perhaps one of the most interesting things I learned is that there's a market for horse poo. I didn't know. Horse poo.
Yeah.
So as I was walking, I saw a sign that says horse poo $2 here in Victoria. The moment I crossed to New South Wales, and I have the pictures, said horse poo $3.
Wow.
So I have now empirical evidence that Sydney is more expensive than Victoria.
So that sounds like a arbitrage opportunity.
So I was so bored. I was also bored that I started thinking, what if I become a poo merchant?
Yeah.
Right? Because I can become a millionaire, right? If I move 1 million bags of horse poo from one state to the other. And in my boredom, I thought about the mental calculations, and it will take me 3,000 years to move 1 million bags of horse poo from Victoria to New South Wales. But with that came the realization that even though it's very hard to do that, I understood the variables a lot better of how to sell shit than to how to implement some of the lessons and signposts that came out of the pilgrimage. So unless we create a market where ideas can thrive, we cannot see them happen.
Sure. So if we stick with boredom for a second, bringing...
All this is boredom. I haven't changed the topic.
they seem pretty interested, I don't know. But how can... I think the gist I got from that section of the book was that, boredom is kind of important for ideas to come together. But bringing that into a work setting could be a bit tricky. So
absolutely. So, yes, the signpost number 6 is boredom could be a useful thinking tool.
Yes,
and I now think boredom is beautiful, which contrasts with the aesthetic that we infuse into workplaces. Usually, and now with experience design, we try to design experiences by the minute, and we want to wow and people to feel this and empower and collaboration and the bossishness around the workplace. But we forget that we need the capability to be bored and reach mental states that we usually don't go that often. I was giving a talk in the US about this earlier in the year, and a guy, after I spoke, he told me about boredom and said, well, I can relate to that because there's a study, there was a reaction to this study. There was a study that says that people rather electrocute themselves than be left with their own thoughts. So as I was explaining that, he afterwards approached me and said, well, when I have a shower, I always leave an earbud in my ear because I like to listen to podcasts or music so as not to be with my own thoughts. And I have wondered myself if I'm going to electrocute myself while I'm showering. So there's a living case that we actually go through those lens of not being bored. And even though I'm actually promoting boredom here, it actually can have negative consequences. So I'm not trying to trivialize it. I'm just trying to give it a voice, to reclaim the ability to get bored, and to learn from the lessons that we derived from that space.
Sure. Okay, so moving back to, I think it was signpost 1, which is, I think going back to iguanas and how iguanas evolved because they were in isolation. And you were drawing causal link from that into how ideas should be able to develop before being shared. Can you expand
So
on that?
yeah, signpost 1 is that I think we share ideas too early and too often, and that gets into the way of the uniqueness of an idea. And I was very happy that it was a few years later that I decided to make this pilgrimage, that researchers at Harvard wrote a paper arguing that we should redesign organizations to isolate people between each other's work so that they can produce better ideas, because the amount of interactions that we create is getting in the way of exchanging ideas. And I'm so happy I didn't know about that paper, because if I had read it then, I would have never done this crazy thing. I maybe just have written a paper of what does that mean to workplace design and move on. And instead did that and came out back with 34 signposts. So there are 34 lessons, not only that. So there's an argument that, yes, perhaps...
So maybe just to be clear, like the signposts we're talking about are really lessons that you came up with during your pilgrimage.
No, those signposts came years after, from the pilgrimage.
Yes, yeah.
So again, the lessons... When I came back, I thought I just wasted 42 days of my life, you know? Although I didn't know what I learned, the effects were immediate, because as soon as I got back to my day job, something didn't feel right, you know? I didn't know what I have learned, but I know that something has changed. And I realized that the thing that we measured, how many people are in the office, who use that room, who doesn't, they were important, but not sufficient to take us to where these signposts, or the clues of where the signposts were pointing to. At that point, I didn't know, but I realized there was something bigger happening. So one of the first things I did after coming back from that experience was to look for more meaningful things to measure. And I came up across researchers measuring dignity in the workplace.
Wow. Yeah.
And so that was a validated scale, and our contribution was to use their instrument of measuring dignity and overlap that data with social network mapping.
Yeah.
What we're trying to see is to measure ways in which dignity can travel through social networks and how the physical environment could help promote that. So there was a big change in my focus of what I started to do and how I started to think about how I see the workplace.
Yeah. So maybe going back to signpost 1, which is about kind of incubating ideas before sharing them, like that really flies in the face of a lot of conventional wisdom. There goes your brainstorming sessions, and but also thinking back to iconic stories of innovation, like Building 20 at MIT is a famous example, where it was a hastily constructed building during World War II, and everyone who did not fit into the usual structure of MIT was shoved into there, and so there was no kind of academic strictures within that building. So these people were allowed to share ideas, and then all these innovations started to come out from that building, like Noam Chomsky's linguistics and Bose speakers and all of this stuff, So how do you counter that with, like sharing ideas seems to generate innovation as opposed to incubating ideas?
Signpost 5.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
tell us that there has to be a sweet spot between isolation of idea and ourselves, because also let's talk about isolation first. So the condition of being by oneself, aloneness, can manifest as solitude and isolation. So isolation is actually the bad manifestation of it. That leads to depression and has to be managed. Solitude is the one that we want to promote and foster. So what we need to make sure is that we stay in the healthy aspect of being by oneself. Funny enough, we can also feel isolated in a group. If we don't feel that we're part of the bigger group, we can still feel isolated. That's also a lesson for designers that design these bossing environments. But if that person does not feel part of that cohort or that group, can feel isolated. But Signpost 5 also recognizes that as an individuals, we also, for our own health, need to socialize, but also for the health of the idea. You mentioned that example. There was also another example done by a professor in MIT as well, that he compared the financial return of people that invested in stock based just on their own ideas without listening to anyone. Other ones that copy everyone else, like the echo chamber, and other ones that have a good balance. And the group that had a good balance between their own ideas and that of others outperform the one in echo chamber and the ones that are completely in isolation. There's another fascinating study that I talk about in the book about the prohibition of alcohol in the US. So when there was the prohibition, a lot of the ideas generated at bars, when that happened, some of the ideas started to dry out, literally. But what happened after that, there is fascinating research. I cited there if you're interested. What they observed is people started to reconfigure the social network and start to interact with people that they didn't interact before. And so the patterns that came after that follow a different direction. So the idea of innovation, that now I talk to someone that I haven't talked before, gives the opportunity to take the innovation into a new field. So that's the balance.
Yeah. So it's similar to like 19th century coffee houses in Europe, which were famous because coffee was a new thing. Prior to coffee, it was gin, so everyone was pissed all the time. But when these coffee houses came about, that's where like philosophers, scientists, all of them kind of got together and exchanged ideas, and that gave rise to the Enlightenment and all sorts of, like technological innovations. So maybe what I'm not getting is, where do we find the balance between aloneness and...
And that's the thing, we don't like nuance. And one example that illustrates this is the sit-to-stand debate. I don't know if you guys remember this, but again, a few years back, there was this, everyone was talking about how much time we should be sitting down, how much time we should be standing up, because there was this paper written, sitting is the new smoking. And eventually they realized that it was standing up for prolonged time is as bad as sitting down for prolonged time. So the recommendation is the best position is the next one. So if you're sitting down, standing up, and standing up, sitting down. What we need to be aware is that it's in the nuance, it's in the balance of things. But people rather have a blank statement, stand up or sit down. Where things get more difficult is for how long, when, which settings. So I think what we need to learn, I'm not saying never exchange ideas before. The ideas in this book are starting to grow because of the conversations that I have, but they have been in isolation for 4 years. So the years that took me to do the walk, plus the incubation of the idea, plus the writing of the book, but now they're starting to take its new path. So I just think, again, let's incubate them for a little bit, could be years, could be months, or perhaps an hour or a day. You sit on it.
Yeah.
Don't just.
So we can agree that brainstorming sessions are a waste of time.
Well, the Adrian Fuller, I think, or I don't want to misquote his name, but he says that, it's here is referenced. He says that research unequivocally, without doubt, suggests that the same number of people working alone come to better ideas than the same number of people working together. There's this book called Quiet, written by Susan Cain. She put together a very interesting argument that's saying that perhaps the need to be together is more a social bond and glue than the outcomes that come out of it. And that on its own should be a good thing. We don't need to justify it or put a dollar value for people gathering. If it gives them well-being and sense of purpose and meaning and so on, let's do it, even if nothing, no innovation comes out of it. Before starting this, I had the opportunity to work in a place called Hoffice. I think it has died out, but how Hoffice worked was that it was a reaction to the movement of co-working, that co-working started with something with strong purpose, but then became a real estate solution for overflowing organizations. And so these guys say, well, let's open our house, for people, and you can come and work from our house. So I registered to one of these events. So went there, rang, and very welcoming. They say, welcome, here it is. They point to the dining table. That's where we were going to be working. And they show me around the house, the bathroom. And the bathroom was, the towel was still hanging there from that morning's shower and so on. It was a very domestic environment, which contrasts with what we perceive to be corporate environments. And then they had a balcony where we're going to take phone calls, if you're going to make all the zoning happening. And I was there to do meetings and interviews with people that were working there. And then she opened the one room and said, here, you can do your meetings here. And it was her bedroom. And I mean, it was something intimidating doing the meetings in a bedroom. So it talks about the rules of engagement and how we interact with space. We actually end up going to a coffee shop and do the interviews there. But everyone that went to that session, on that day at least, they were working on their own. They were not working in a office environment because they were collaborating, because they needed to deliver a project. They were there because they wanted to work amongst others, to be together alone.
I think just touching on the book Quiet again, I think Susan Cain's point was that a lot of what we do in the workplace are kind of catered towards the more extroverted of us, and the introverted among us feel either distressed or left out, or
Absolutely, and that goes the workplace as a whole, but also how the meetings. We also design meetings that people that can articulate their point better or more vocal about it, perhaps push an agenda that someone in the corner might not be able to. So and that's when I talk about design work first and then the workplace.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if we take this into account, as she quantifies, 50% of the population are in the other side, then we can design better work environments in its policies and its physical container.
Another thing you talk about in the book, and I think also something that you felt physically while doing the pilgrimage, is this notion of adversity and how that kind of leads to ideas and insights, and maybe it could be maybe stretching yourself and discovering new things about yourself. Can you speak a little about adversity?
So I decided to do the walk in winter to manage two of my biggest risks. One was fires, and the other one were snakes. So I thought, well, if I do it in winter, I manage those two. I only saw one live snake, but again, I have a collection of pictures here of rubbish that looks like snakes. So
It's equally scary.
yeah. So at least I have so many. But I was freezing. So okay, I mitigate that risk, but I was freezing. I was cold, I was hungry. I was hungry even while I was eating, which I thought it was impossible.
Wow.
But and all the type of discomforts that you can think of, I felt alone. All the things I experienced, the uncertainty of where I'm going to sleep. But with all those adversities came learnings. And I almost can guarantee you, without personally not knowing you yet, but that you will have come with situations that were adverse to you. But because of that adversity, you became a better person, or you find more meaning or a solution to something. And philosophy, Matt mentioned before that some talk about the Nietzsche, they remind us of the risks of creating a society that is such adverse to adversities, that we're creating a person that has lost hope and risk and adventure, and we're translating that to the workplace. And I think the outcomes in the workplace inherit that. There's this quote that again I mentioned in the book that says from the movie The Third Man, from Orson Welles reminds us that for 50 years during the Borgias in Italy, there was bloodshed and chaos, people killing each other, and gave us the Renaissance, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and so on. And for 500 years of democracy in Switzerland, stability, everybody loving each other, and they gave us the cuckoo clock. So if we intuitively and personally know that adversity has some attributes that allow us to innovate, why we're so adverse? And I know why we're adverse to adversities, because it's adverse. So one of the things, so signpost 4 is that we should keep or introduce adversities in the workplace. And some signposts are easy to follow than other ones. This one is very difficult because design specialists genetically engineer to get rid of adversities. In a way, it's part of its purpose. So when you design something, it's to make it more usable, frictionless design, and so on. So how do you use now design to bring back friction? So when I came back and then I had all these signposts pointing to different places, or at least it seemed to be pointing to different places, I tried to follow them. So, okay, you're telling me signpost 1, this, signpost 2, all the way to 34. Where do they lead us? And I follow them, again, in the scale of pilgrimage, months, 6 months following them. And I could not reach them. And it was an interesting point to reach, because I thought I could not get closer, but I could not get away from them. I could not find the answers, but I could not get rid of the questions. So, and I didn't want the book to be like an inspirational type of book. Yeah, let's promote absurdity in the workplace and this and that and good luck and see you. I don't know how you're going to do it, but you should. So I have a chapter called Laying Paths, which is following. I talk about my experience of following signposts, which I invite everybody to lay their own way. But I also take you to what I have learned so far. And there's a beautiful thing about knowledge, that despite being invisible, it can be mapped. So I did a knowledge map about adversity in the workplace and how adversity travels in organizations. And it travels through intangible and tangible environments. tangible environments is what usually designers deal with. Temperature, illumination, factors of the physical environment. And intangible environments are organizational culture and so on. And you can see the map is here. And we go through different regions in the book. And what I like about that is that the region of intangible environments is a lot bigger than the one in tangibles. So that region is from research that comes from management and leadership and so on. And there's a paper that I came across that tries to predict scientific creativity by 3 factors: work practices, collaboration, and adversity. So straight out of the bat, they position adversity alongside the darling of contemporary workplace design, collaboration. And I let you read their paper and the book to see what happens there. But at least they ask the question if adversity can be a predictor of creativity in scientific endeavors. In design, we don't tend to ask that. There's some fringe studies that people in cold environments are more productive. But productivity and innovation are different.
Yep.
How fast can you type because you're shivering or doing something? Activity is different of the quality of the idea.
I think that signpost especially would be tough to implement because there's I think a fine balance between adversity in the workplace and toxicity. And I think, a lot of us, working in big organizations are, hopefully not too familiar, but some of us are familiar with toxic work environments. So how do you see the balance between that?
So we need to differentiate adversity, that is, should not be toxic. I interview some people when I couldn't find my way out of following signposts. I interview people, and people told me, well, you shouldn't make more adverse for females to get promoted in the workplace. So no, adversity should never be used to exclude. One of the few instances of design that I came across that actually actively use adversity is to exclude people. It's called hostile design. And we're more familiar with it than we should. And I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with it. If you go to a bench in a park, you will see there's a armrest in the middle. That's not it's for you to put your arm, but it's usually to prevent people to lay.
Homeless people do.
Homeless people do.
Yeah.
Unlike that, they put spikes. So it's called hostile design to prevent some behavior. So I'm not suggesting that type of design. What I'm suggesting is the type of design that promotes. So there are 2 ways. One, there's a body of knowledge called man interactions with environment, or person interaction with the environment. What that suggests and looks into the level of adaptation that the person has with the environment. So it argues that traditionally, are we in a level of adaptation? Right now, the moment you forget about the environment is because you have adapted to it. Once there is a stimulus, then you become aware of the environment, and then you try to match it. So what I'm putting forward is to create an environment that increases the demand from the person in just the right amount so that people can actually reach that. Because if it's higher than that, then it breaks the person. So you can constantly be in constant adaptation and with learning processes in the environment. The other one comes from the intangible environments. And it comes from a concept called organizational slack. And initially, the assumption was that organizations with a lot of slack, a lot of resources by people, economic or time, were better positioned to innovate. So if you were IBM or Google, whatever, you have so much money and resources that you are better positioned to innovate than others. Then research started to suggest that actually the little ones, the small ones, the ones with less resources, they think harder and more creatively about how to use the resources, and we're better positioned to innovate. Now, the current thinking is that actually too much slack can create different behaviors that are, people don't take it into advantage and conduce to the early termination of an organization, where no slack at all doesn't allow people to think. So there's again that sweet spot in the middle that is so difficult to strive. How much of slack is the optimal?
Yeah, and I think that's, I suppose, Silicon Valley lore almost of, a startup coming up in a garage and then taking over the world. Just to go back also to something that you said, and you mentioned quite strongly in the book, is that, and maybe, going back to one of the previous questions of what is the role of an architect, and really that an architect should really look at the design of work rather than the workplace. One distinction you make in the book is that we now kind of work in, there's a difference between doing work and doing tasks, and that now a lot of our work environments are really task environments.
Yeah, so finished the walk to Sydney, came back, things happened, described it there, but then COVID hit, right? And with COVID, many things happened, we all know, but one of those things was that our life became more digital. And I was looking at my Instagram feed, and I came across a company that was offering a virtual pilgrimage. So you could do El Camino in Santiago, walking wherever it is that you walk. I'm pretty sure you have done this, perhaps, that pretty much you count your steps, and then you put it into a website, and then they map your progress on the map. So I registered to do El Camino de Santiago online, and I was just walking around my house, putting there. And I talk about that in the book because that allows me to deconstruct the pilgrimage from its walk. Can you walk somewhere and the pilgrimage happens somewhere else? And that set the foundation to deconstruct work from tasks. And the analogy between a pilgrimage and its walk, it's very similar to task and work. So task is how you progress work. But what gives you purpose, meaning, is work itself. Task is the activities that you do. And now that the workplace is questioning its purpose, it's because perhaps it's more like a task place. I then, as part of this process, I then look back into what I carried to Sydney in my 2 backpacks, and I realized that 99% of the things I took were to help me progress the walk. Warm clothes, beanie, shoes, boots, things that will help me progress, sleep, and so on. I just took 2 things that helped me with my pilgrimage, which were a book and a notebook and a pen to write my thoughts. So I think that we can also unpack our workplaces, and that's an activity that I invite the reader. Think about your workplace as a backpack, or start unpacking what items there help you to do tasks and which ones help you to do work. And this is very subjective, because for you might be something that gives you a sense of purpose and meaning. So it's not that a one answer fits all, but so I think to reclaim the purpose of the workplace, it needs to become that spaces where people find purpose and meaning, and not task places.
Yeah. And I think, a figure that features quite significantly in the book is the myth of Sisyphus, and I think that's where when you get too caught up in tasks, it's. If you can explain the myth of Sisyphus and how that relates to what we were talking about. Yeah.
So when I was planning the walk, I frame it around the idea of Sisyphus, from the Greek gods that he was punished to push a big boulder up a mountain just for that to come back and do that for eternity. So I thought that was a good analogy for my pilgrimage, just putting one step in front of another for what seemed to me to be an eternity. How do you find purpose and meaning in that? And so I called my pilgrimage Sisyphus Goes to Sydney. And that analogy extends to work, tasks that we can do at work, and also life as a whole. I also talk about the role of gamification and how this push of efficiencies has stripped meaning out of tasks. So we have created such effective tasks. It started from Max Weber, the German economist, that look at decontrusting tasks to see how we can be more efficient, and in doing so, remove purpose out of it. So now we're using gamification and other things to bring purpose back to activities that we have stripped them naked through optimization.
So one route, I suppose, to meaningful work, which this podcast is about, from what I'm understanding, is this distinction between tasks and work, and that we should really focus on, like you said, the backpack, like what's in the backpack that really progresses the work that we do, rather than just these tasks.
Absolutely. And because the last signpost that I talk about, 34, is that in a workplace with only tasks to do and no workplace will suffice.
Yep.
If we only there to, part of the conveyor belt, no workplace will suffice.
Does it matter where we work for work to be meaningful?
It's funny you mention that, because that's a question that I started writing the book with. A lot of this book happened during the pandemic, and I was watching one speech from the Prime Minister telling us how we're going to move forward from the pandemic. And he was talking about...
Which Prime Minister?
Scott Morrison.
Ah.
I was trying not to say it.
Okay. Cat's out of the bag now. Anyway, yeah.
But so he was saying how we were going to do this, get out of the pandemic. And he talked about an experience before he joined. He was a prime minister, and he was visiting a New Zealand yacht club. They were defending their America's Cup winning. So he went there, and the yacht club, the America's Cup, it's very prestigious and millions of dollars. And he was making the comment of how surprised he was how bad their offices were. The tables were scratched, the chairs were not great, and the whole office were not what you were expected to look like for the America's Cup. And then the guy said, well, in Team New Zealand, we only ask one question: what make the boat go faster? And then I talk about in the book why that story made me think about, well, does it really matter where we work? What actually makes the boat go faster? Because they actually won. New Zealand kept their title, so the officers didn't make the boat go faster. So does it matter where we work? I started writing this book with that in mind. And now I have 34 reasons why I think it matters where we work. But perhaps they're not the traditional reasons why we think it matters.
Or maybe, I suppose, a more specific question that's, I think, in the times that caters to the times we live in, do we need to be in an office to find meaning in the work that we do? Or
we need to be in a workplace, not in an office.
Okay. Yeah.
And we're always in a workplace when we work, even if that's at home. Again, another chapter in the book talks about the workplace doesn't disappear when you don't go to your office. If anything, the workplace has atomized. Now everywhere you work is your workplace. And for far too long, we have overlooked the workplace, the home as a legitimate environment to work. Funny enough, in the history of work, home was hosted work first than the office. People used to work first from home, and then they moved to offices. So now working from home is actually going back in a way to where things were.
We're quickly running out of time, so this will be the last question, which is usually the question I end the podcast with. And this podcast is called On Meaningful Work. So what does the term on meaningful work mean to you?
That's a beautiful question, but also it talks about this problem. For me, it's like saying wet water. The fact that you have to think about meaningful work means that we're doing tasks. Work in itself is or should be meaningful. That's how we build sense of identity, belonging, and so on. The fact that that is not the case is a sign of our times.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Gus. Really appreciate it. This is, your second appearance with DBN, and it's always been an amazing treat chatting with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you.
And yeah, please. And before we break, I just want to say a huge thank you to, I think, firstly, Folio for partnering with this event. It's been an amazing collaboration, and hopefully we can do it in the future. To Dan the Man for taking care of the audio and video, and for those of you who saw the trailer to this event know what a great job he's done. To Kai for illustrating the beautiful image for the event. Thank you for that. And finally to Stone and Chalk for really hosting us and making us feel at home here tonight. So thank you all, and yeah, thank you for coming, everyone. Now let's get some vino.
Let's do it.